News
media, pod, one is story, news, story, news, narrative, story, news,
are not
has been quite the news, who's where debate, and should, this has been even with the people who are at a one news
narrative,
news,
narrative,
story,
Just
news story,
news,
narrative, news, narrative, news, narrative, news,
story,
news,
narrative, story,
narrative,
narrative, story,
narrative,
narrative, story,
news,
or convince how
faith,
story, narrative, story,
news,
it's a journal.
story.
news.